So this is the story of how my grandfather first enlisted for war, and it was in August of 1914. But a little bit of background to it, because he only arrived in New Zealand less than 2 years before World War One broke out. He was aboard the Tongariro, and he came in to Wellington on October the 10th, 1912. There's the Tongariro, and I even managed to find his name on the passenger list when he was 18 years old and he was a clerk. Now, there's a whole backstory about how he was born in Dunedin, but grew up in London, and then at age 18 on his own, got on a transport ship and came back to New Zealand. But that is for another day. And some of the information I have from this comes from my Uncle Duncan, the eldest son of my grandfather. That's him on the left, and he wrote a family history, and I'll be citing that a little bit later. And there, of course, is Grandad as an old man. That's after at least one of his major strokes when he's confined to a wheelchair. But you can see very clearly that scar across his cheek, a legacy of World War One. Now, when he arrived in Wellington, there was a family who was very good to him, and he was quite an influential man in the local area. He was a former mayor of Wellington. He had also been a member of parliament, and he had actually visited London, and Grandad had actually shown him around a little bit while he was visiting London. So that was the connection. And even in later years, my mother remembered visiting his elderly widow. I think that was who it was, she said she remembered visiting. And somehow or other, I believe through the connections of Aitken, he got some jobs on some dairy farms in the Taranaki area of New Zealand. Now, from the accounts of my Uncle Duncan, it was pretty hard. He went through 3 different places, and the farms were run more or less well, depending on which ones he was on. But it wasn't looking very satisfactory, and he was probably ready for a change when 1914 came along and World War One broke out. So he was at a farm at a place called Matapu, just a little bit north of Hawera in the Taranaki area, and the recruiting office was, well, in Hawera. And I did it on Google Maps to see how long it would take you to ride your bike from Matapu to Hawera, and Google Maps told me it was about a 50-minute bike ride. And the story we get from Uncle Duncan's family history is that Grandad rode his bicycle to the recruiting office and left it there and never went back for it, straight into the army. Now, whoops, I've done something wrong there, but never mind, we'll just carry on. Now, Uncle Duncan's story goes like this. I'm just going to read it out as he told it. This is my grandfather was always ready to relate how he managed to pass the medical examination. Bruce suffered from poor eyesight and was well aware that this could result in his rejection. There were a number of men waiting to be examined by the doctor when lunchtime arrived, and the doctor went off, leaving them in the waiting room. Bruce quickly discovered that he had left his door unlocked and was able to spend the next hour learning the eyesight test off by heart. And what I was trying to highlight, and I should have had the animation for that red circle, was that if you go to his attestation papers and his medical inspection, you'll see that his right eye and left eye are both rated 6 by 6. And that is the equivalent of 20 by 20. In other words, he was said to have perfect eyesight, which we know to be false. And in fact, you can see it here. There's a photo on the right when I think it was shortly after he came to New Zealand with a couple of his cousins when he was about 18 years old. You see him wearing glasses there. And there's a photo from later in his life after he was married with children, and you see him wearing glasses again. So we know his vision wasn't perfect. So at least it partially corroborates the story of him faking his eye test to get into the army. Because you have to remember, it wasn't like later in the war. In August of 1914, they were only taking the fit men. You could easily have failed a medical examination at this time. And to give you a sense of just how early in the war it was, Britain's declaration of war against Germany was on August the 4th. Now, that was actually August the 5th as far as New Zealand was concerned because of the time zone difference. And New Zealand didn't even have to declare war herself because, as part of the British Empire, Britain's declaration of war included territories such as New Zealand. And you can see down here from his attestation papers, he had joined up on the 18th. That's 13 days after New Zealand had joined World War One, exactly 2 weeks after Britain's declaration of war. And, I like to chase down every little rabbit hole and see what I can learn. And I decided if I could see who was the attesting officer, ACC Stevens. And I thought I'd have one little PowerPoint if I could find out who he was. It turns out that Captain Alfred Charles Cornwallis Stevens of the New Zealand Army Staff is a very interesting fellow indeed, and he is going to get his own episode at some point later because it would take far too long to tell his story. Interesting guy. That's to come in the future. Now, the Army is famous for its lack of logic. They say military intelligence is an oxymoron, two words that contradict each other. And according to Army logic, he had been working on a dairy farm with cows, and there's basically no difference between a cow and a horse, so that's how he ended up, according to Uncle Duncan at least, being assigned as a driver, a private in charge of horses. Now, a small little science digression is that even though a cow and a horse seem very similar from appearance and they both eat grass and that kind of thing, if you actually look at the genetics and the evolutionary history of them, they are far, far separated. A cow and a sheep are actually quite close genetic relatives, and the genetic relationship between a cow and a whale is in fact closer than the genetic connection of a cow to a horse. They come from completely different lineages. They are representative of parallel evolution. Now I have another source to introduce to you. It is the MA thesis of Andrew McRae Davidson, who was a veteran of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. Now, he wasn't there at the start in 1914, but he wrote his master's thesis about the Mounted Field Ambulance and had gone through and interviewed a number of people and backdated the story to before his time. And there's also an interesting story about how I acquired this. I actually communicated with his son, and his son was kind enough to mail me the original of the thesis so I could get a copy of it and we could mail it back to him. So I would really like to thank the son of Andrew Davidson. Now, here's a little quote relevant to what happened after he had first signed up. After 3 weeks training at the Adderton camp, the medical section proceeded to the Awapuni Racecourse near Palmerston North, where it was joined by the detachment of the Army Service Corps, which was to be responsible for the transport of the sick and wounded and victualizing. The ASC drivers were recruited from all parts of New Zealand. So this is Grandad. Grandad is an ASC, Army Service Corps driver, attached to the Mounted Field Ambulance. The lack of sound training, characteristic of the ambulance recruits, was common to the ASC drivers, only about 1/3 of the men being capable horsemen. Well, I think they would certainly describe my granddad as not being a capable horseman, given that he didn't really like horses, didn't have much experience with them, and had just been working on a dairy farm. The New Zealander, being an adaptable individual, that defect was of minor importance in comparison with an absence of equipment, especially the necessary vehicles. We'll come back and revisit that latter sentence. And when you look at his footnotes, goodness me, I would love to find that source. The Staff Sergeant Major Kidman, he had a diary that Davidson was using. I would love to see that. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know where it is. And that he also interviewed a warrant officer, C. George, not sure who he is yet. I will try and track him down. And these were the basis of his conclusions about what it was like in the early days. Now, to give you a sense of where they were sent, the New Zealand military at the time was divided into 4 distinct districts. There was the Auckland district, the Wellington district, the Canterbury district, and the Otago district. And Taranaki, where Grandad was living, I'll show you that's the area over here, that part jutting out on the west coast of the North Island, was designated to be part of the Wellington area, and all of the Wellington recruits were marshalled in the New Zealand city of Palmerston North. Now a pop quiz question for you. Who said the following about Palmerston North? If you wish to kill yourself but lack the courage to, I think a visit to Palmerston North will do the trick. You can imagine that this rather famous person is not very popular in Palmerston North. It was, in fact, John Cleese of Monty Python. Apparently he had a rather bad time when he visited Palmerston North. And I found a few photos from 1914. These were some New Zealand soldiers parading in the main square of Palmerston North. And this is the Awapuni Racecourse where the soldiers were sent to camp. So all of the troops from the Wellington district were camping at this racecourse, which was just on the outskirts of Palmerston North at this time. Now it's more really an outer suburb. And there's quite a number of shots from this particular racecourse. And here are a selection of photos I managed to find of what was going on at the campground. And even today, you can still find this memorial for the New Zealand soldiers who served in World War I at that racecourse. And fortunately, I managed to find a few primary sources to give me some insight into what was going on. And one of the interesting ones is the diary. Well, in fact, this is the opening sentence of his diary, so I just took that as the title. Diary of the Ups and Downs of a Common Soldier. This was written by a guy called Charles Cates, who arrived a little bit later and was initially just billeted with the mounted field ambulance because the army didn't really have a job for him to do, and it took a number of weeks for him to be officially taken on strength or officially put on the books of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. And of course, I would love for him to have made some mention of my grandfather. He never does that, but nevertheless, you get a situation, a feeling for what the situation was like, shall we say. And in his diary, much to my delight, he had this pencil map of the Awapuni Racecourse showing where all of the different men were camping. And that lets you locate. You see there is the hospital, and under it is the ambulance. So that's where he would have been camping, and that's also, of course, where my grandfather would have been. Now, I'm going to give you a few quotes from the diary. So Cates was there with 3 other guys in the same situation with nothing to do. And on August the 27th, he wrote, "The camp commandant is going to fix us up soon. The wheels go round very fast in the army, I don't think. Some ladies gave us a decent concert in one of the large marquees. The singing was some class." So that's August the 27th. But he actually had to wait till September the 3rd before eventually he was put on the books of the Mounted Field Ambulance. And here's what he had to say about that. "Received instructions from headquarters to report to Mounted Field Ambulance, taken on strength of that company. We had our first route march along the South Road, 4 miles to Longbourn Freezing Works. A few houses and a nice railway station composed the town. About 100 yards past the town we rested. 2 of the boys went across the road to a large house to see if they could get anything to drink. The people said certainly, and instead of handing out water, they invited the 55 fellows and 2 officers in to the afternoon tea, to have afternoon tea. With the tea, buttered bread and cake they handed round, we needed no second telling, and if amount is anything, well, we certainly made ourselves at home. They would take nothing for it." So they were trying to harden the men, as they say, taking them on route marches, longer and longer route marches, getting them toughened for, well, going out in the field. Was my granddad with them as one of the men who cared for the horses? I have no idea, but he might have been. And then there's this amusing story as they're getting ready to go back from having this nice afternoon tea. When falling into march back, our officer, Captain Bell, who was being When falling into march back, our officer, Captain Bell, who being a doctor and new at the game, raised much suppressed laughter, for after he had given the command attention, number, etc., he asked the men to form 2 deep. Please, in other words, officers giving orders to men aren't supposed to say please. So Cates had been in the territorials the part-time soldiers, and quite a number of the other men had military experience, and they thought it was rather funny to have an officer give them an order and then ask them to please do it. And I managed to get a photo of Captain Bell, Captain James Alexander Terrace Bell. And if you see a little asterisk beside somebody's name like this, that is because I plan to make a whole episode about them. I have an interesting story to tell about Captain Bell, so that will come in the future. And then one more story. We reached camp at 5 p.m. There were plenty sore about, as the glacy kid boots the army supplies are slightly larger and more heavily constructed than the civilian kind. Old Bill Andrus, 41 years of age, stepped along like an Irishman doing penance with peas in his boots. My feet were fairly sore. We collected a small amount of money among the chaps and mean to give our friends at Longbourn a present for their spontaneous kindness. Now, I included this quote for several reasons, but most particularly the reference to old Bill Andrus, because you see there's another star by his name. He has a really interesting story to be told. And sad to say, actually, both Captain Bell and Bill Andrus did not survive the war, but their military histories reveal, well, some quite interesting episodes. So 3 of the characters who come up today, there's Captain Stevens, the enlisting officer, there's Captain Bell, the mounted field ambulance officer and doctor, and Bill Andrus, a private, all of which will have their own episode in coming times. The other reason I included it really was this very strange saying which caught my eye: stepping along like an Irishman doing penance with peas in his boots. Now, I've tried to look up that saying. I presume there's a story or a tale that it was a saying that was common in 1914, but I haven't been able to find it anywhere. If somebody watching this episode happens to know what that saying means or where it comes from, I would love to hear the answer.